Okay, in this lecture, we're going to be talking about the classification of tissues: epithelium, connective, muscle, and nerve. This is a really important concept to understand, right? When cells come together by different types of junctions that you may have learned about. Tight junctions, gap junctions, um, desmosomes, hemidesmosomes. So there's adherence junctions. There's a bunch of junctions, which is really just a way of connecting cells together to make tissues. And the four types are epithelium, connective, muscle, nerve. Of the four, muscle and nerve tend to be the easiest. Epithelium and connective have many categories underneath. So again, the four different types of tissues based on structure and function are epithelium, connective, neural, and muscle. So when we talk about neural tissue, I've seen this question pop up in the past on some of the Connect quizzes, right? So it's like blank is a network of specialized cells that monitors the internal and external environment and initiates commands through which the body reacts. So neural tissue, a nervous tissue, is a network of these cells that monitors internal and external environmental conditions. That's what neural tissue does, because it receives sensory input, it processes that information, and then sends out a motor command. And the neural system is composed of these two primary cells, one that is electrically excitable and that conduct electrical activity called neurons. And the second type of cell are called glial cells or neuroglial cells. The term glial in neuroglial means nerve glue, like it holds it together. So the neural system receives sensory input, processes it, and sends out a motor command. Epithelial tissue. Epithelial that we'll be talking about, it's going to be the first type of tissue that we discuss, is classified, meaning it's named by the number of cell layers and the shape of the cell at the top, meaning the apical surface, which is at the top layer when you look at it under a microscope. So there's a bunch of different names that you're going to hear when we talk about epithelial. In terms of shape, you'll hear cuboid, columnar, and squamous. Cuboid, columnar, and squamous. That's in terms of shape. And in terms of layers, if it's one cell layer thick, we use the word simple. And if it's multiple cell layers thick, we use the word stratified. So if I had one cell layer thick of cells, they look like squares or cubes, we would call it simple cuboidal epithelium. But if we had multiple layers of square-like, cube-like cells, then we would say stratified cuboidal epithelium. If we had cells that look like tall columns or buildings, then we would call them, if they were many layers, we could call it stratified columnar epithelium. And if it was one cell layer thick, we call it simple columnar epithelium. Okay. Let me skip down to the bottom here where it said epithelial tissue. Epithelium forms the surface layer of body. It lines the body cavities. It's found in hollow organs and structures, and it constitutes most gland tissue. So when it says it's found throughout surface layers of the body, that means we're going to see epithelial tissue around the skin, especially the epidermis. When it lines body cavities, well, that means we're going to find it around the heart and around the lungs and around the digestive tract. Everywhere we have a cavity, like the peritoneal cavity that we learned about, the cardiac cavity, and the pleural cavity. And epithelium is also found where we have tubular systems, tubes, like the digestive tract. When I hear the word tract, I also think of that interchangeably with a tube, like a hose, all right? Just like a hose, like arteries, veins, that's a tubular system. The digestive tract, the esophagus is a tube. The small intestine and large intestine, these are long tubes. The respiratory tract, the trachea, is a long tube. The reproductive tract, again, the urethra, the ureter, these are long tubes. All right, so anywhere you hear tubes or tracts, we're going to find epithelial tissue. Okay, let's go back here where it says 3 types of muscle. Muscle comes in 3 flavors: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. I'll show you what they look like when we go over it. But skeletal these are muscles that we're going to be learning during week 3. Week 2, which is what we're in now, is osteology. Right? So muscles attached to the skeleton, and when those muscles contract and the skeleton moves voluntarily, that's skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle just relates to the heart. Smooth muscle is what we find where we have glands, not glands, where we find organs, blood vessels, the uterus, the stomach, the intestines, the trachea, anywhere things can constrict or dilate, where tubes can constrict or dilate, is going to have smooth muscle. So again, arteries can constrict or dilate, that's smooth muscle. The trachea for your windpipe can constrict or dilate. When it's constricted, you have wheezing, like asthma, and when it's dilated, you get more oxygen in. Okay, this is what happens when your sympathetic neural system is stimulated and you need to run, right, to get out of danger's way. The pupils dilate for better vision. The trachea opens so you can get more oxygen in, so you can deliver more oxygen to your muscle. You can run and get out of danger's way. Okay, so 3 types of muscle: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Muscle tissue is widely distributed throughout the body to allow for movement of the skeleton and other tissues in the body, the muscle tissue. Let's go down to neural tissue at the bottom. It's composed of 2 types of cells, the neuron and glial cells, or neuroglial cells. And the last type is connective tissue, which is very diverse, it's very abundant, and widely distributed throughout the body. There's lots of categories. So under connective tissue, things that connect things together: ligaments, cartilage, bone, that's all connective tissue. The different types of cartilage. Blood is even considered connective tissue, believe it or not. Whether it's white blood cells or red blood cells, it's still connective. So tissues are going to have distinct structure, patterns, right? So when we look at certain structures, they'll dictate what their functions are. And tissues come together to create organs like the heart, the kidneys, the lungs, the stomach. And the arrangement of tissues into an organ is what's going to determine how that organ is structured and how it functions. When we study tissues, we call that histology. So let's look at the first type of tissue, which is epithelial tissue. This is going to line the external surface of the body, like the epidermis. There's dermis, which is deeper, and epi means above. So we have epidermis, the layer of skin above. It's important for the lab, when you look at the epidermis, you're going to have to know microscopically the 5 different layers of the epidermis. And they all pretty much start with the word stratum. Stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and then the stratum basal layer. So there's 5 different layers to it. They also line body cavities and tubules, right? And the other slide, it just talked about body cavities, but I mentioned tracts or tubules. Arteries are tube, veins are tube, trachea is a tube, small intestine, large intestine, they're all tubes. And we also can throw in the glands as part of that specialized epithelium. Okay, so glands like the mammary glands for milk production, the sweat gland known as the sudiferous gland, and the sebaceous gland, which is your oil producing gland. So glands are also classified as epithelium. What are some of the functions of epithelium? Good question. So when we think of the skin, right, the skin is designed to protect us against friction or bacterial invasion or chemical damage, right? If we didn't have skin, then the deeper tissues would be exposed and we'd be prone to a lot of bacterial and viral infections. So excessive friction, bacterial invasion, chemical damage, we're all prone to that, so we have epithelium to protect us. Within epithelium, we have cilia that can attach to that, and cilia are designed to beat rhythmically. Within the trachea, we have, let me see if I can show you on the whiteboard. Give me a second here. Let me use the whiteboard. Okay. Okay. Hopefully you can see my whiteboard. If not, you can chime in. So let's say here is the trachea. And remember, air that you're breathing is going into the trachea. And the trachea or the windpipe is going to have these cells. And these are going to be, we're going to call these columnar cells because they look like columns. And these are going to have nuclei within them. So we'll put a little nucleus in each of these. And these are going to line the entire trachea. And then we're going to have these cilia here, these little hairs, extensions coming off, and these are going to be on both sides, right? So it's going to have cilia. And these cilia are going to beat rhythmically. They're going to beat upwards in this direction. And we're going to put another type of cell. Let's put a, let's call it green. Let's put a green one here. There's going to be a goblet cell here, a goblet cell. I put green for goblet, right? So goblet cells are here. And what you'll read about goblet cells is that goblet cells produce mucus, okay? So mucus, they're going to release mucus through exocytosis, and it's going to stick to the epithelial surface where the cilia is, right? So all this is green mucus. And remember, the cilia are there, and the cilia are beating upward. So when you breathe in air and it's coming in, all the dust particles and debris can now stick, right? The dust particles can stick to the mucus. But remember, the cilia are beating upward, whereas the air is trying to come down, right? It's trying to come down, and then it's going to try and go into each lung, right? These are the lungs. So air is going to try and come down and into the lungs for the sole purpose of picking up oxygen, delivering oxygen into the lungs. And we don't want debris and filth getting in there. So thank goodness the cilia are beating upward so that any type of dust particles that are trapped, you can simply do this, right? And it comes up and you can get the debris outward rather than having the debris come in. Now, if the debris does make it in, we do have specialized cells, thank goodness. We do have these specialized cells in the lungs that are called alveolar dust cells. And what they are macrophages. Macrophage, the word phage comes from phagocytosis. It's going to engulf and eat and break down all that debris. Okay, so that's the purpose of the cilia. They're beating rhythmically. These cilia are also found, let's say this is a woman's uterus here, and then there's going to be fallopian tubes coming out this way with these fimbriae. You're going to have another fallopian tube this way. And then let's say here's an ovary and here's an ovary. The ovary, right, eventually during ovulation, when luteinizing hormone gets really high, the ovary is going to release an egg this way, right? The ovary is going to release an egg this way. And that egg is going to be moving in this direction. And what's making it move are these cilia that are in here. And these cilia are going to be beating, again, rhythmically, but they're going to be beating in this direction to try and bring the egg this way. Whereas sperm, right, sperm are making it in this way. There's the head of the sperm and there's the tail, and they're trying to go in this direction. And when the sperm makes it here, it's going to try and fertilize the egg. And when fertilization happens in the fallopian tubes, but then the cilia are beating rhythmically to bring it back here for implantation to take place, right? So the cilia are beating rhythmically. That's why cilia are super important, okay? All right, fantastic. Let's go back to, let's see if I can get back to my presentation. Okay. All right. So back to the presentation now. So we understand how important cilia are for sweeping dust and foreign particles, but I also showed you another important purpose of cilia besides the trachea with the fallopian tubes or the uterine tubes. It's important for absorption. The stomach and small intestine have epithelium, and epithelium is very, very important to absorb nutrients. It's important for filtration. When I think of filtration, I'm thinking the kidneys. The kidneys are involved with filtration. It's going to absorb, secrete, and filter, which is what the kidneys do. Deep, deep, deep within the kidney, the functional unit of the kidney that's called a nephron. And you'll get to that in A&P2 when you learn about urology and the kidneys. But when the body is trying to get rid of debris, it uses the liver and the kidneys together. The liver is involved in breaking down fat-soluble toxins, and it tries to break down these toxins and makes them more water-soluble. And we call that phase 1 and phase 2 of liver detoxification. And liver phase 1 and 2 need a lot of vital nutrients to break down toxins. When it does and it becomes water soluble, now the kidneys are one method of excreting those toxins out through urination. You can release it through the breath, you can release it through bowel movements, you can release it through the skin, through sweating. So epithelium is really, really important for absorption, filtering, secreting, and even excreting out, as you can see the next one for excretion. Secretion, well, you have glands like the mammary glands and the sebaceous glands and sudiferous glands are secreting. And sensory reception. We have epithelium that covers the entire surface of the body, and the skin is highly, highly sensitive, right? You can feel if a little mosquito or an insect is crawling on you. We talked about cilia, which are the long, slender extensions. We can see them coming off the plasma membrane. They help to move secretions and fluids across the cell surface. And then we have smaller ones called microvilli that are used for absorption. And microvilli are very, very important clinically, especially along the GI tract, the gastrointestinal tract. You need to have microvilli in the small intestines. When people are sensitive, let's say they have celiac disease or they're sensitive to gluten, those type of chemicals can destroy and break down the microvilli, which means when you're eating food, the microvilli are the sponge that brings in the nutrients into the lacteal system if it's fat soluble, or into the arterial and capillary system for water soluble nutrients. So microvilli are very important for absorption of vital nutrients, especially in the intestines. We spoke about the classification of epithelium. We either say if it's one layer thick, it's simple epithelium. If it's more than one cell layer thick, we call it stratified. And again, it's based on the number of cells at the apex, right? The apical layer at the top, or the layer that's closest to the lumen, or the layer that's closest to the lumen, which is the hole or the tube in which certain elements are flowing through, like blood, right? Blood can flow through the lumen of a blood vessel. So the cell shape can be squamous if it's flat and irregular, cuboid if it's square, or columnar. So let's take a look at this illustration here. If you look right in the center where it says simple cuboidal, these look like cubes, like squares, and it's one cell layer thick. But if we look just below it, we see that it's 2 layers thick, also cubes. So when it's one cell layer, it's simple cuboidal. When it's more than one layer, we use the word stratified cuboidal. Let's look to the left where they're flat, irregular shaped cells, simple squamous versus stratified squamous. Now, the ones at the bottom are not squamous, but the first few layers to the apical surface are flat, irregular. It's more than one cell layer, so we call it stratified, okay? Let's look at the third column here. So simple columnar versus pseudo-stratified columnar. Now, simple columnar, one cell layer thick, they're tall columns, so simple columnar. Notice that the nuclei that you see here, and you see here, and you see here, these nuclei are at the same level. But if we look down below, look at the nuclei that are found at multiple levels. Because it's found at multiple levels, it's giving it, in this particular case, the illusion that it's stratified, but pseudo means false, so it's a false stratified columnar. These are still columnar layers, but it's still one layer. It's not one on top of the other, okay? Typically, where you see pseudo-stratified columnar, there are also going to be cilia. Where there's pseudo-stratified columnar, there's going to be cilia with that. Transitional, I want you to think of a balloon, right? A balloon that's deflated. If you were to put, let's say, a circle there, right, with like a marker on a deflated balloon, and then you blow up the balloon and the size changes, it stretches out, right? Whatever it is that you drew starts to deform and it changes shape because now it's inflated. When you let the air out and it deflates, it goes back to its original shape. So transitional really is telling us that when you have organs that have the ability of changing their shape, getting smaller and bigger, they're going to have cells that also change in shape, so they can transition. I think of the urinary bladder primarily when I think of transitional cells. The urinary bladder can be filled with urine, it can be distended, or it can be emptied, okay? So simple epithelium, stratified epithelium, squamous, we said, is irregular shaped. When you learn osteology this week, you'll see that within the skull, there's a squamous suture, and there's a little bit of a squamous shaped bone near the temporal bone, okay, because it's flat, irregular shaped. Cuboid looks like a cube. We're going to find those near the kidneys. The kidneys, again, have a functional unit referred to as the nephron, and the nephron has tubules called proximal and distal, convoluted, because it's very convoluted, distal and proximal convoluted tubules that are made up of cuboidal cells. And then we have column-shaped cells. Okay, so we spoke about pseudostratified. We said that the nuclei lie at different levels. It gives this false appearance that it's really stratified, but it's not. And we often see cilia wherever we find pseudostratified epithelium. Okay, but it's really one cell layer thick. With transitional, again, we're thinking of organs that can change in shape and size. So the urinary bladder, the ureters, and even parts of the urethra can alter in their shape. They can stretch, and then they can recoil back. So in terms of simple epithelium, there's simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar. And in stratified epithelium, there's stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, stratified columnar. Then we have the unique one, which is pseudostratified, where it's falsely stratified, but because the nuclei are at different levels, it gives the illusion that it's really stratified. And then you have transitional that's found along the urinary bladder, the urethra, and the ureters. Okay, so simple squamous epithelium can function in diffusion, filtration, secretion. So simple squamous, right, it's one cell layer. Think of a piece of paper, right? It's just one cell layer thick. It's not a full ream or a stack of paper. It's not stratified. It's not stratified squamous. It's simple. So when you have something that's one cell layer thick, think of also like a coffee filter, right? It's one cell layer, and things can diffuse and pass through that. So that's the word diffusion, is that it can filter and pass. The water can pass through that because it's only one cell layer thick. But if you look at stratified squamous, now you have a full ream of paper, right? That's great for protection. Super for protection. It just so happens that, think of the top layer of the skin, right? If you were to scratch yourself with your nails and it was only one cell layer, you'd be bleeding right away. But the top layer of the epidermis is multiple layers. So it happens to be stratified squamous, in fact. Simple cuboidal, we said we find that at the proximal and distal convoluted tubules of the kidneys with the nephron. So that's for absorption, secretion, and even protection. Pseudo-stratified columnar, this is what I showed you with the trachea. But since I was just introducing it, I wrote columnar cells when I did that drawing a little while ago. But in the trachea, it's really pseudo-stratified columnar. That's why I mentioned wherever you have pseudo-stratified columnar, there's going to be cilia with it. And that cilia is going to be moving the mucus that's produced by those goblet cells. You have those cells within the intestines, you have them within the trachea, and they produce mucus. Transitional is going to accommodate the distension and relaxation when organs change in their organ volume, like the uterus or the urinary bladder. Okay, so that's it for epithelium. Okay, so in your mind, you got to think epithelium. You're thinking simple, stratified by layers. Then you got to think shape. Is it squamous? Is it cuboidal? Or is it columnar? Okay, if you have that in mind, great. The other thing I want you to keep in mind is that with epithelium, it's cells that are held very closely together, right? When you look here, all of these cells are closely packed together. That's a unique feature of epithelium. You do not see this type of presentation with connective tissue. Connective tissue is just the opposite. You have cells that are far apart from one another. They're not closely packed. Notice these are packed closely together with very, very little extracellular matrix, meaning there's very little space between the cells. But when we look at connective tissue, we have widely spaced cells that are separated by matrix. We call it extracellular matrix. Extracellular compared to intracellular, right? Intracellular is within the cell. Extracellular is what we find outside the cell. So connective tissue is lots of cells, but they're spread far apart. There's lots of ECM, or extracellular matrix, that's made up of ground substance and even protein fibers. But it is the most abundant and variable type of tissue that we have in the body. It's found in all different parts. Some of the functions is that it's going to connect organs to each other. It can connect even to the epithelium, to the rest of the body. It gives support and protection, especially immune. So we're thinking white blood cells, right? Your leukocytes, your monocytes, your lymphocytes, your macrophages. These are all part of the immune system. Even antibodies, okay, all part of the immune system, connective tissue. Storage of energy and heat production because of adipocytes or adipose. Adipose are fat cells. So fat cells are used to store energy because that's what a triglyceride is. It's a bunch of fat, right? You have these fat cells and then you have sugar that's stored in them. That's what a triglyceride is. It's the storage of energy. Adipose also stores toxins. So it makes us look at obesity in a very different light, because obesity, when you have lots of adipose, they're storing toxins. And maybe as a protective mechanism, right? Because you don't, if you think of, let's say, a farmer that sprays pesticides and fungicides and herbicides, right? These are all carcinogens. They're toxic. They spray them on these plants, and then when bugs come to try and eat them, it kills the bugs. Why? Because it goes right to the bug's neural system. Why? These bugs, you never see a morbidly obese spider or a morbidly obese ant, right? They don't have fat cells. If they did, it would be stored in there. We have fat cells. So we can tolerate a lot of these toxins and carcinogens because our fat cells store them. And then little by little, when our body can handle it, the adipocytes open up and they release their toxins, and then the liver filters them out, sends it to the kidneys, and then the kidneys can excrete it through urine. That's the beauty of how the body works. And then we have movement and transport of materials through the body, because we remember I said earlier, blood is connective tissue. So let's look at the different categories first. Notice that we have connective tissue proper, we have loose connective tissue proper, we have dense connective tissue proper, we have fluid connective tissue, we have supporting connective tissue like cartilage, and then we have bone, right? So we have lots of different types of connective tissue, that different categories, and that's important to know. So again, loose connective tissue, dense connective tissue, fluid connective tissue, supporting connective tissue, and we have bone. And the reason why it's important to know those is because you'll see as I go further, there's been some questions that pop up that want you to drag and drop, right? Like what falls under loose connective tissue, areolar, adipose, and reticular. What falls under dense tissue, regular, irregular, elastic. What falls under supporting connective tissue? We have cartilage and bone. What we have in cartilage, the three different types, hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. When we talk about bone, compact bone and spongy bone. We talk about fluid connective tissue. We talk about blood. So connective tissue, right, those categories, connective tissue proper, supporting connective tissue, and fluid connective tissue. Okay, so I can go back here. It'll help us understand why we need to know what's under some of these categories. So under loose connective tissue, there's areolar, adipose, reticular. Areolar is going to be like if you pinch your skin, like this, and you can separate your skin, right? It's areolar is that pad that separates skin from the muscles that's deep to it. An areola is composed of elastic and collagen fibers. Collagen is stronger, elastic gives it elasticity. Adipose, these are fat cells, sometimes they're called adipocytes. Adipocytes have nuclei that are off in the periphery. They're not centrally located like we saw with epithelial tissue. When you see a cell that may look like, it may look like a squamous cell because it's flat, but you don't see a centrally located nucleus. It's off to the rim, to the periphery. That's going to be an adipocyte or fat cell. Fat cells are metabolically active. We'll talk about them a little bit during the fourth week when we cover endocrinology, because they do secrete and release cytokine that can be inflammatory. That's why during the pandemic, we learned about the cytokine storm and that people that are obese have more fat cells that can release more cytokines, have a much more difficult time struggling with just about any type of virus or bacteria due to adipocytes. Reticular, it provides the framework of support for many organs. Now, so that's loose connective tissue, areolar, adipose, and reticular. We look at dense. This is when we're going to have collagen fibers, the protein fibers, more closely packed together, especially with dense regular. So we have dense regular connective tissue and dense irregular connective tissue. With dense regular, we have these tendons, these densely packed collagen fibers that are found with tendons and ligament that are interwoven parallel to one another. Now, tendons are an extension of muscle. So how do muscles attach to bones? They attach by way of tendons. A muscle contracts and it transmits contractile tension to the tendon. Not very elastic. That's why tendons tear and rip. Those tendons attach to bone. So when muscles contract, they transmit their tension to tendons. Tendons yank the bone and create movement. Ligaments, on the other hand, ligaments attach bone to bone. Ligaments hold bones in alignment with one another. Dense, irregular connective tissue. This is found deeper than the epidermis in a layer called dermis. And we have collagen that's interwoven in many different positions and many different directions. So, you know, when you get massaged, massage does not have to be in one particular direction. It could be in many different directions, and it's because the orientation of those collagen fibers. Elastic connective tissue is found with certain ligaments, especially vertebral column. Now think of the spinal column. It's 24 fully movable vertebrae. They are very, very stable, but the spine is very flexible. So because we have...
Sorry for interrupting.
You lose me?
Yeah, you're very choppy.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, I hear you much clearer, but I'm just gonna wait like a couple seconds to see if it'll break down more because it's like every other word almost.
Okay. How about now? Can you hear me now? Like this? I took off my headset, so hopefully it's not the headset.
Yeah, I believe it was the headset.
I'll continue like this.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So we have dense connective tissue. We have dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic connective tissue. The elastic, as I said, this type of ligament, these ligaments attach to the spinal column, and your spinal column is very flexible. And because it's very flexible, we need those ligaments to be very elastic, not super strong. We don't need them to be very strong because those bones, the way they interlock, are pretty stable. But where we have joints, let's say the knee joint, which is very unstable, or the shoulder that's very unstable, we need to have more collagen there. So elastic is for elasticity. Okay, so we have connective tissue proper, we have loose connective tissue, and we have dense connective tissue, dense regular and dense irregular and elastic connective tissue. For fluid connective tissue, we have blood and lymph. Blood is red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Red blood cells are known as erythrocytes. Erythro means red. Leukocytes, leuko means white. And platelets used to be called thrombocytes because they help form a thrombus, which is a blood clot, which is why it helps to stop bleeding. When you use aspirin or baby aspirin, that inhibits platelets function, which means you can't clot very well. We see this a lot in the elderly that take baby aspirin. When you look at the back side of their hand or you look at the forearm of anyone that's on a blood thinner, you start to see bruising or black and blue. That's a bad sign. When you see that, it means their capillaries and blood vessels are rupturing due to it being too thin. Okay, so red blood cells, because they carry hemoglobin, hemoglobin carries oxygen. It carries carbon dioxide. The white blood cells, the leukocytes, are involved in fighting infections because of your antibody production and macrophage and monocyte capabilities. Lymph is a parallel circulatory system, if you would. So lymph is found between cells, right? The interstitial fluid that's found between the cells of the human body can enter these lymphatic vessels. It's basically trying to, your lymph nodes, like your spleen and your tonsils, you have lymph nodes in your armpit, in your groin, in front and behind your ear. It's trying to filter and clean out your blood as well. That's part of the function of the lymphatic system, is to cleanse and return healthy fluids back into circulation. For supporting connective tissue, we have to talk about cartilage and bone. And cartilage is avascular, right? Vascular means blood vessel, a means without. So avascular is no blood supply or poor blood supply. Muscles have a good blood supply. Tendons have a pretty good blood supply. Ligaments a little bit less.
Keep in mind, the better the blood supply, the quicker those tissues can heal if they ever get damaged. So if you have a torn muscle or tendon, they can heal pretty quick. If you have a torn ligament, it takes a little bit longer. And if you have damage to cartilage, like cartilage in your knee, like the meniscus, or cartilage in your shoulder, the labrum, or cartilage in the hip, the labrum, these can take a little bit longer to heal. Okay, or even your discs, your intervertebral discs are also cartilage. So the three main types of cartilage are hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the one that's most common type of cartilage. It's found between bones that are moving. So at each joint of my finger, there's going to be hyaline cartilage. At my elbow joint, between my humerus and my radius and ulnar, there's going to be hyaline cartilage. Between my shoulder, between the scapula and the humerus, there's going to be hyaline cartilage. At my hip, at my knee, anywhere you have two bones coming together, cartilage will be there because they cover the ends of the bone surface that form a joint. Elastic cartilage is found where we have body parts that need to have more flexibility. Your ear is hyaline cartilage. Your nose is hyaline cartilage. I'm sorry, not hyaline, elastic. My bad. The ear is elastic, right? You can deform your ear, let go, and it recoils back. Your nose, your epiglottis in your throat that closes off your windpipe. So when you swallow, food goes down your esophagus and not your trachea, right? Elastic is also found within the inner ear. Fibrocartilage is the strongest cartilage in the body. We have that found where your intervertebral discs are, the IVDs, the discs, and also where your pubic bones come together. There's a vertical cartilage called the pubic symphysis. When you do osteology and you look at the pelvic bones and you go over the ilium, the ischium, and the pubic bone, where the pubic bones come together, there is a vertical cartilage called fibrocartilage that's called the pubic symphysis that's there. Very, very strong. I've seen this pop up every now and then. This looks like certain type of cells. They look like raindrops, right? So this ends up being hyaline cartilage, but what's highlighted is the blue between it. So remember, between the cells is extracellular matrix. So this happens to be the matrix of hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage has these unique, looks like raindrops to them. Now bone, you're going to hear of a term called an osteon, which is found with compact bone, not spongy bone, but compact bone. You're going to hear of osteocytes. You're going to hear osteoblasts. And you're going to hear osteoclasts. So simply put, osteoblasts are an immature cell that makes matrix. It's going to push out the cement. It's going to push out calcium salts. Right now, cement, when you put out concrete, cement eventually hardens and becomes solid. So the osteoblasts, which is this immature cell, is going to lay down this matrix of bone cells, not bone cells, of calcium. And this calcium will calcify and harden and ossify. And when it does, the osteoblast gets stuck in the matrix that it was involved in producing. And now the osteoblast can't do anything. It becomes functionless, it becomes mature, and it becomes an osteocyte. Okay, so the osteoblast becomes an osteocyte after it gets trapped in its matrix, and it gets stuck in this little space. The space that it gets stuck in is called a lacuna. The lacuna is the space that the osteoblast gets stuck in when it's called an osteocyte. Okay, so the osteoblast makes the matrix. It produces the calcium salts. It gets stuck in its calcified matrix. Now it's called an osteocyte. The osteocyte is housed in its space called a lacuna. So osteoblasts build up bone. The osteoclasts break down bone. So the B in osteoblast for builds up bone. The osteoclasts break down the bone. So they build and break down. Right? Anabolism, catabolism, building up, breaking down, building up, breaking down. Everything builds up and everything breaks down. We want to make sure that it's done so in harmony, because if you're breaking down bone faster than it can build up, that's osteoporosis. Okay, I will show you where these concentric lamellae and circumferential lamellae are. These are just rings. They look like if you were to chop a tree down and you look down on an oak tree and how it has many, many rings. That's what the concentric lamellae are. I'll show you the canal. I'll show you what these other, what interstitial lamellae are and canaliculi are and Volkmann's canal. I'd rather show them to you in a picture. I mentioned the lacunae before. That's the cavity that contains the osteocyte. Periosteum and endosteum, the outer layer of bone is periosteum. Peri is on the outside. The endosteum is the layer of bone that's on the inside. So you have periosteum on the outside, endosteum on the inside. It's going to cover spongy bone is where the endosteum is. Okay, so here, if you look on the top left, here, this looks like the femur. Okay, at the top part, here, this is spongy bone. This is spongy bone here. Compact bone is the perimeter, the outer layer. So right here on the outer layer, which would be here, this outer layer is compact. This is compact bone. On the inside portion is spongy bone. And it looks very porous and spongy, right? It has like the trabecula, like this crisscross. The osteon is this. So each of these circular things, like this is an osteon, this is an osteon, all of these 1, 2, 3, 4 that I'm pointing out here, these are 4 osteons. Here's another osteon. In the center where you see the artery, vein, and nerve, that is called the Haversian canal or the central canal. These rings going around them are called concentric lamellae. Concentric lamellae. Between the osteons are interstitial lamellae. And all interstitial lamellae are, like here, between the cells, are remnants of old osteons. Remember I said bone is made and broken down. Osteoblasts build up, osteoclasts break it down. So this relationship of making and breaking bone, you're bound to get osteons that are broken down, and the interstitial lamellae are just remnants of older osteons. You can see that bone is vascular. You have blood vessels going through it. So when you break a bone, it will bleed. You can see the periosteum is the outer layer of the bone. You can see this like, looks like sky blue appearance. And then the endosteum is on the inner layer of bone. It's where that spongy part is, okay? So spongy bone here is number 1. And then we're gonna have the periosteum, which is number 3, all the way on the outside, okay? Each of these are osteons. So number 6 is an osteon. Within these, let's see if I can go back here. Within these concentric lamellae, there's going to be osteocytes trapped in a lacunae. And you could see these canaliculis, which are these little extensions. They're like little finger-like extensions coming off of the osteocyte. Those are called canaliculis. Okay. So here, again, it looks like a a microscopic view of an osteon, this looks like a tree with all its concentric rings, like a tree was cut down. So what we're seeing here is really an osteon. What we're seeing here, these hollowed out black sections, these would be lacunae. These are all lacunae, and what's in there is the osteocyte. So here, the blue sections, these are lacunae. Okay, so some of the characteristics of connective tissue. Most connective tissue is highly vascular, good blood supply, except cartilage, tendons, and ligaments. Of these three, tendons have the best blood supply. Ligaments probably come in second place, and third place would be cartilage. It gets a little bit worse, okay? Okay, so that brings a close to connective tissue. Muscles, we have three types: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Skeletal is the only one that's voluntary. You can consciously, voluntarily move your biceps, your triceps, your quadriceps. You can move your head left and right. Skeletal muscle is consciously and voluntarily controlled. Cardiac and smooth, involuntary, right? Your cardiac and smooth muscle, you cannot say, okay, heart, let's beat from 72 beats per minute, let's go 75 now, let's go. Can't happen. A woman whose monthly bill comes and you're menstruating, you can't say, okay, uterus, I know you're cramping, I know it's contracting, stop, right? You can't do that voluntarily, okay, on the spot. So here, these are important because I've seen these show up on some of the Connect questions. Not this particular slide, but the concepts that are here I've seen show up. Number one, we can see that they're striated. So once we see striations, right? Once we see striations, that linear pattern of light, how it passes through these protein filaments, it can only be two possibilities. It's either skeletal or cardiac. Because if I go to cardiac muscle also looks striated, okay? We can see that the difference between skeletal, look at how parallel everything is here. But when we look at cardiac, we can see how branched it is. So cardiac muscle is striated, but it is highly branched. When we look at skeletal, they're long, cylindrical, multinucleated. There are striations. Their function is voluntary movement. We're going to find these in skeletal muscles. When we look at cardiac, besides the striations and being branched, the other unique feature that cardiac muscle has that skeletal does not have are these intercalated discs, right? These vertical discs that are called intercalated discs are really junctions, right? It's where one heart cell, one cardiomyocyte, and another cardiomyocyte, where they come together. It's like the teeth of two different combs coming together. They form this intercalated disc. If we pulled them apart and looked in them, we would see these hills and valleys deep. And that's where the gap junctions are. Gap junctions are used for fast, rapid forms of communication. The heart, the way the heart works is that both atrium, let me see if I can come out of this for one more second and show you something on the whiteboard. So if, let's say, here's the heart. Okay, I'm going to draw it like this. And the heart has a right side and a left side because of anatomical position. there's a right atrium, and there's a left atrium, then there's a left ventricle and a right ventricle, okay? And blood pumps from the atrium down into the ventricles on both sides of the heart, okay? And the atriums have to contract at the same time. I mean, gravity is going to take most of the blood down, but whatever's left in the atrium contracts from superior to inferior. And when all the blood is out and the blood starts pooling up in the ventricles and the pressure gets too great, that's when the ventricles contract to push the blood out of them. And the ventricles contract inferior to superior when they contract. When it does contract, this valve shuts and this valve here shuts. And that shutting of the valve is like a closing of a door. That's what makes the heart sounds. Lub dub, lub dub, lub dub. There's going to be another valve here and another valve here. Okay, this valve right here and this valve right here. This valve is called the pulmonary semilunar valve, and this valve here is called the aortic valve. So when the ventricles contract inferior to superior, and this valve shuts and this valve shuts, these are like a push valve. This is like a push door. Blood goes in here, and blood is shunted in here. This becomes the aorta, the arch of the aorta, and this becomes the pulmonary trunk that's going to divert blood into your lungs to pick up oxygen, to oxygenate the blood. Okay? So the reason why I bring this up is because where the intercalated discs are, that's where the gap junctions are, and it's used for fast, rapid forms of communication because every single cell that's in the atrium has to get the message to contract at the same time on both the right side of the heart and the left side of the heart. So the atrium contracts and then the ventricles contract. Atrium, ventricle, lub dub, lub dub, lub dub. Okay. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. So again, skeletal muscle is striated, very parallel. You see the cardiac muscle highly branched, striated, but you have the intercalated discs. Smooth muscle, you don't see the striations. That's why they're called smooth. And they look spindle shaped, right? They look spindle shaped. This is involuntary. You're going to find these around the arteries. You're going to find these in the uterus. You're going to find these in the small intestine, the large intestine, the trachea, things that are found in the walls of organs that you can't consciously control. Okay? And the last type of connective tissue is going to be neurons, right? The neural tissue. When we look at a neuron, when we look at nervous tissue or the neural system, we said there's dendrites and neuroglial cells. The neuron is electrically excitable. The neuroglial cells are not. So this is a neuron that has three main parts to it. It has a cell body, which is one part, called the soma. We have dendrites. In Greek, the word dendra means highly branched or trees. And then we have an axon. So you have dendrites, cell body, and an axon. Dendrites, cell body, and an axon. Those are the three main parts of a neuron. If you look at your hand and your forearm, to me, that's a neuron. The fingers would be the dendrites. The palm of the hand would be the cell body or the soma. And then the forearm would be the axon. Okay, for three main simple parts. So input, sensory input comes into the cell body, it processes the information, and then the information leaves through the axon. Notice that it's myelinated, there's myelin. Myelin is created by a neuroglial cell or a glial cell. If it's in the brain and spinal cord, it's called an oligodendrocyte that produces myelin. And if it's in the peripheral neural system, meaning it's outside of the brain or outside of the spinal cord, it's called a Schwann cell. Whether it's a Schwann cell or an oligodendrocyte, they myelinate. What do I mean by myelinate? Myelination is an insulation. It protects the neuron. It protects the axon. Otherwise, imagine you had an extension cord that was plugged in, and the layer that protects it, let's say I had this here, this was my plug, and notice I don't see the wires. I don't see the wires because of this white protective insulation. This would be called myelin. If this myelin was broken down and I could see the copper wires and I touched it, what would happen? You can get electrocuted, get shocked. When that happens within the body, when the myelin breaks down, we call that MS, multiple sclerosis. That's when the myelin breaks down because the body is attacking it. There's an autoimmune condition where the body's producing antibodies that's attacking the protein on myelin. It doesn't recognize itself as being part of the self body. So it degenerates it and breaks it down, and you get multiple sclerosis, which decreases the conduction of electrical activity. At the very end of the axon are axon terminals. At the end of the axon terminals are these end bulbs that house neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters release, a neurotransmitter is a chemical messenger. Like in the endocrine system, the chemical messenger is hormones. In the neural system, the chemical messenger are called neurotransmitters. And these neurotransmitters can be on or off switches. They could be a stimulatory message or inhibitory message. So we have some neurotransmitters that are excitatory, like an on switch. Like when you get up in the morning, you need to spring right out of bed. That's called glutamate. Glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain. And now, let's say the nighttime starts to happen, right? The daytime you wake up, you spring into action, glutamate does its thing, but what happens in the evening, the flower starts to close up. In the morning, the flower opens, in the evening, the flower closes. Glutamate is the opening, spring it into action. Glutamate turns into GABA, which is gamma amino butyric acid, GABA. That's an inhibitory neurotransmitter. That's like turning the switch off. That's why at nighttime, you should be able to sleep because of GABA, the inhibitory neurotransmitter that shuts down your brain. Now, if you have trouble sleeping at night because you have too much electrical activity in your brain, that means you don't have enough GABA and you have too much glutamate. If you wake up in the morning and the alarm goes off and you're like, snooze button, just give me 5 more minutes, I don't want to get up just yet. Or if you're a snooze button hitter, that means you're lacking glutamate and you have too much GABA in the morning. Okay, so that's the importance of neurotransmitters. That's what's stored at the axon terminal. These neurotransmitters are released through a method called exocytosis, which is releasing its contents. Okay, let's finish up here. I think we're going to do a little bit of the skin and the nails, and then we'll be finished up here. So the integument, which is the skin, the hair, the nails, and the gland. In this picture here, we could see a little bit of the hair, and we could see the skin. When we look at the skin, we have a top layer called the epidermis, look on the top left there, and then below it, we have the dermis. The dermis has a superficial layer, which is like the top 20%, called the papillary layer, and then down below, we have the reticular layer. Okay, we have a papillary and reticular. So you have epidermis, dermis, and then below that, the hypodermis, right? Hypo is underneath, hypodermis. Make sure you're familiar with the top 5 layers. I'll go over with these with you in just a few minutes. They have 5 layers of epidermis. They all start with stratum, stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basal. Those are the 5 layers. The dermis only has 2, but notice what else is in the dermis. We've got muscle. We have glands. We have lamellated corpuscles. This is neurological tissue, right? So the reason why we cover the skin now, and summarize it all, is because the skin has all 4 types of tissue. It's got epithelium, it's got muscle, it's got nerve, and it's got connective tissue. It's got blood vessels, it's got adipose, right? So it's got it all. So that's why the first system that we start looking at is the integument. It kind of puts it all together. Okay, what else do we have? Here we have, this is a sweat gland here, a sudiferous gland. Here's another sweat gland, a sudiferous gland. Here, this is a sebaceous gland. This secretes oil. When the oil is secreted, it moves up the shaft of the hair and creates this watertight antibacterial seal around the skin. So you don't get any type of bacteria coming in here infecting the sebaceous gland. That's what creates acne. Okay, so some people create acne by washing their skin too much and sanitizing too much, right? You wash off the natural oils, the natural antibacterial protection that the innate intelligence of the body knows how to produce. Okay, so let's just go back to a quick little review here. We have supporting connective tissue. We have supporting connective tissue proper, and fluid connective tissue. Let's do it in the order that we learned it. So connective tissue proper, we had loose connective tissue proper, which was areolar, adipose, and reticular. And then there was dense, which was dense regular, dense irregular, and dense elastic. Then we talked about supporting connective tissue. With supporting connective tissue, we talked about cartilage and bone. Cartilage came in 3 flavors: hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibro. Hyaline cartilage was found in most of the freely movable parts of the body. Elastic cartilage we find along the spinal column, where you have more elasticity. You also have elastic cartilage here around the ear, the nose, the lungs, the epiglottis. And then we have compact bone that had the osteon, the concentric lamellae, the osteoblast that made the matrix. Then that immature bone cell became an osteocyte when it got trapped in its matrix, and the osteocyte was in the lacunae. The hole in the middle was called the Haversian canal or central canal, where the artery, vein, and nerve were. Fluid connective tissue is blood and lymph. This is another drop and drag that I've seen on Connect, where it gives you a list of items. You have to drag it and drop it. So what we said about epithelium, we know that we had the different shapes like squamous and columnar. We had simple versus stratified. So anything simple, squamous epithelium, stratified, cuboidal epithelium, pseudostratified, transitional, that falls under epithelium. Under muscle was only smooth, cardiac, and skeletal. Under nervous tissue, that's nervous, right? That's the neuron or the neuroglial cells are under nervous tissue. And under connective tissue, we said there was areolar, adipose, elastic cartilage, compact bone, hyaline, all under connective tissue. Under elastic cartilage, we said the epiglottis in the throat was elastic. We said the external ear was elastic, and the eustachian tube inside the ear was elastic. Under hyaline cartilage, the end of the bones are hyaline cartilage. The nasal septum, when you do osteology, that nasal septum that's made up of the vomer and the particular plate, that is hyaline cartilage. The thyroid cartilage of the larynx is hyaline cartilage. And the cartilage going around the trachea, called the tracheal rings, are also hyaline cartilage. The fibrocartilage is the pubic symphysis, where the pubic bones come together, the intervertebral disc between each vertebrae, and then the meniscus between the knee, the medial and lateral meniscus of the knee. Elastic cartilage is composed of a network of branching elastic fibers, so that's pretty straightforward. Fibrocartilage is mainly composed of type 1 collagen fibers that are parallel in bundles, and hyaline cartilage is primarily composed of type 2 collagen fibers. This is really important. I use a lot of nutraceuticals in my office when I treat patients, especially with types of arthritis like degenerative arthritis or osteoarthritis or rheumatoid arthritis. And we supplement them with a nutraceutical that has type 2 type collagen fibers. Type 2 collagen fibers are really important to help regenerate a lot of the cartilage at the knee, at the hip, at the shoulder. Very, very important. And then type 1 collagen fibers for the discs, the intervertebral discs. Okay, we already spoke about connective tissue with the 3 main categories: connective tissue proper, supporting connective tissue, and fluid. Fluid connective tissue was blood and lymph. Supporting was cartilage and bone. And the cartilage was hyaline cartilage, elastic, and fibrocartilage, and under bone was compact and spongy. We focused more on compact bone with the osteon, the concentric lamellae, interstitial lamellae, lacuna, osteocyte, canaliculi, all of those major parts of the microscopic part of the osteon. And then under compact bone was loose and dense. Loose was areolar, adipose, and reticular, and dense was radial and irregular. When we look at the skin, I've seen this pop up before. What is the highlighted section? Hypodermis, subcutaneous, epidermis, dermis. The top layer is epidermis. The middle section here is dermis, and way at the bottom is hypodermis. When we look at the epidermis, here's the surface, the apical surface. There are 5 main layers. A little silly mnemonic is Cher loves getting skin Botox. Cher loves getting skin Botox. Stratum, like stratosphere, just means layer. So stratum corneum, look at this top layer. It's like 25 to 30 layers of stratified squamous epithelium. That's what the stratum corneum is. Now, the skin layers are produced all the way down here at the bottom, where you have the stratum germinativum and the basal layer. Sometimes these are incorporated as one layer. The stratum basal is sometimes called a stratum germinativum, because the germinativum layer, this layer is where we have stem cells that push upward, right? They multiply and divide, multiply and divide. They keep moving superiorly up and up and up and up and up until it gets to the top layer where these cells are dead and they slough off. So they slough. It takes about 4 weeks to go from this stratum basal layer at the bottom, or that stratum germinativum at the bottom where it has the stem cells. It takes 4 weeks to get to the top and they slough off. 1 month. When it's sloughing off quicker, that's typically an autoimmune condition called psoriasis, P-S-O-R-I-A-S. Psoriasis comes from the Greek word pasati. Pasati means fish, because fish, the layers on the outside look scaly, silver and scaly, and that's what psoriasis looks like, where at the base of the occiput, behind the elbows, in front of the knees, that's where the signs of psoriasis typically show up. Vitamin D happens to be very, very helpful, by the way. High amounts of vitamin D for people with psoriasis. So if you happen to be in the class, maybe a good idea to get your 25 hydroxide levels checked, vitamin D, and see if you're deficient. It could be very, very helpful for you. So stratum corneum, top layer. Stratum lucidum means lucid. The stratum lucidum is only found in parts of the body where we have thicker skin. Palms of the hand, soles of the feet. If you're walking barefoot, you need an extra layer. If you're crawling or you fall on your hands, you need an extra layer of protection. So the stratum lucidum is only found in the palms of the hand and the soles of the feet. The stratum granulosum, it looks grainy, it looks granular, and those granules produce some oil secretions as well. The stratum spinosum has a spiny look, and then the stratum germinativum, also referred to as the stratum basal layer. This is where your stem cells are. And then you have these dermal papilla. These dermal papilla are involved in giving you your fingerprint. The dermal papilla are involved in giving you a unique fingerprint. Okay, so now here we're looking at the skin, the epidermis, and it's asking us what this top layer is. The top layer, that is 25 to 30 layers of stratum stratified squamous epithelium, is called the stratum corneum. So this on the top is still stratum corneum. The highlighted one here is one layer deep. So share for corneum, loves, that's the lucidum, stratum lucidum. Share loves getting skin Botox. Then way down at the bottom layer is the stratum basal layer. These are where the stem cells are. They multiply and divide, and they start pushing upwards until the skin sloughs off. And that's why you got to change your pillowcases and change your bedding, right? Sheets, because lots of bacteria like to live on the skin, right? And that skin sheds off. So, you know, every week when you do your laundry, make sure you wash your bedding and your pillowcases. Okay, we did the epidermis. So what's this layer here? This is epidermis, this is dermis, and then down below, hypodermis. Okay, and this is where a lot of your blood vessels are. This is why within the skin, when you learn the skin, you're going to learn about the keratinocytes, you're going to learn about the melanocytes. And the melanocytes produce melanin, which is involved with skin pigmentation. So when the UV rays come down and they hit the melanocyte pushes out melanin, and that melanin is pigment that goes between each keratinocyte, and it darkens it up. So when sunlight comes down, the sun is going to hit the pigmented part and protect all your stem cells and blood vessels down below. So it has protective purposes. All of us should have the same amount of melanocytes, but how much melanin we produce is different and unique from individual to individual, which is why we have so many different tones of skin color. The more melanin you produce, the darker you are, the less melanin, the lighter your complexion. There are some autoimmune conditions like vitiligo, and there's one more I'm drawing a blank. It'll come to me in a second. So vitiligo is when you have areas of patchiness, where you have darker skin, and then you have areas that are lighter skin. That's vitiligo. There's another autoimmune condition against an enzyme called tyrosinase. Okay, when you don't have tyrosinase, you end up being completely pale or completely white. Okay, that's another autoimmune condition. Here on the bottom, we have dermal papillae. So up here was the epidermis, and the layer of the epidermis, which is stratified squamous epithelium, is going to be stratum corneum. Then you have the stratum lucidum, and way down at the bottom here is the basal layer, but these are the dermal papillae that are involved with producing your fingerprint. Okay, now we're going to finish up with the nails. Okay, so when we look at the nails, we have a free edge, we have a nail body, and then we have the cuticle back here, also known as the apontium, and then the nail root. Next to the nail root, we have the nail matrix, which also made stem cells. And much like skin, multiply, divide, multiply, and divide, instead of pushing the skin up to the surface, this pushes the nail further up, where you have dead nail where you can clip without having any type of discomfort or pain. When we look at the finger from the side view, like here's the distal phalange or the distal phalanx of the pointer finger. Here's the free edge of the nail. Here's the nail body. Behind it is the lunula, it's like the moon-shaped white part. Here is the cuticle. And then back here is the nail root. And behind the nail root, the matrix. The nail matrix is the epithelium proximal to the nail root. It contains these cells that multiply and divide and produce new nail cells that pushes the nail forward. Okay. So here is the nail body. This would be the nail root, and if it was up here, that would be the free edge. Okay, that's your distal phalange, middle phalange, and proximal phalange. Nails are really important clinically because they can tell us a lot of what's happening metabolically when we look at a person. When we see something that looks like this, where you see the cuticle is really thick and the nail is clubbing downward, we see this with advanced lung issues, like lung cancer. We can also see it with heart failure. Anything creating deprivation of oxygen for a long period of time, we see people with clubbed nails. We see it with people that have eczema, cardiac heart failure, people that have been smoking for many, many years. We also see it with people that have intestinal problems for some reason. We see it with people that have celiacs, some intestinal permeability issue. This is what it looks like. This is what clubbing of nails look like. And you can see it could be the result of deprivation of low oxygen or lung diseases. We also see intestinal issues like inflammatory bowel disease, cardiovascular issues, liver issues, and even AIDS. So clubbing, this is your normal nail. It starts to flatten out a little bit, and we get this thicker cuticle and starts to round out in the front. Different than spinning of the nails. Spinning is when the nails come up. We see that with fungal infections. We also see it with diabetics. When we see this part, the nail body, the nail head here should be pink, right? When you don't see it pink, we see it more white. We're thinking primarily anemia, like a B12 anemia, like a pernicious anemia, or iron deficiency anemia. Without B12 and iron, you can't properly utilize oxygen. And that's why we see anemia or congestive heart failure showing with the whitening of the nails. It can also be malnourishment and severe liver disease. This is, you see this is an indicator of skin cancer called sublingual melanoma. Cancer just doesn't show up on the skin itself. You can see it through the nails as well. We can see the sharp ridging, right? Like these vertical ridges. These are seen with diabetes, some thyroid disorders, B vitamin deficiencies. It looks like nail wax. Wax got dropped on the nails and it's dripping down. Can also be seen with Addison's disease. We'll talk about Addison's when we talk about the endocrine system. It's when there's cortisol imbalance, as well as chronic stress. Okay, let me stop the recording and see if